Hello, family. Okay, we're going to try this again. I'm going to point in the right direction and we see if it works. Okay, I got that one. Okay, I think we're going to do it this way. Yeah, thank you. All right. This is Will Allen. He's the founder and the CEO of an organization called Growing Power. And Will grew up a farmer. He put that expertise to use to create a model for really highly efficient urban farming that uses wasteland and waste products in urban neighborhoods where there's very little growing and very little fresh food available. And then these places have turned into centers for kind of community activities and for education as well. So he's got, fish and goats and worms and huge piles of compost developed out of waste. And he makes something beautiful and useful out of what looks like disjointed trash. So I think this is a great image when we think about the work of making peace in the world, right? This is what it's like. We're looking at a damaged world, at fragments, people cut off from each other and in need, and you use brains. He won a MacArthur Genius Grant, right? This was really a brainy thing to do. You use your brains and hard work and commitment, and we can discover ways that these things do, as we've been saying, flourish together, right? The ways that they belong to each other. So there's been a lot of work going on doing this in human communities as well. And I'm not going to talk about this organization. I'm just going to say, you guys have a year. You should look into the Catholic Peace Building Network. There's really fantastic work going on among some Catholic thinkers around the world who are helping communities in very practical ways to build communities of belonging that have that kind of resilience, a capacity to deal with the struggles and the difficulty and the pain that comes with living together without breaking apart again. So go look them up. Okay, bring me on to another one. For you Catholic social teaching nerds out there, and the rest of you who aren't, why not be? Embrace it. The stuff that I'm talking about peace as mutual belonging, right? Our belonging to God and belonging with each other in mercy. That's really another way of riffing on something that we've heard in a lot of papal teaching in the past few decades. John Paul II liked to talk about solidarity, that we are all interconnected, and that there's a need to commit to that interconnection and to work together. He talked a lot as well about how it's crucial for societies now not to think they make themselves stronger by cutting off people whose lives are a problem. Whether that means we're talking about the elderly or immigrants or people on death row or the unborn, that all of those people are part of the community, all of them belong to it, right? And then Pope Francis has coined this phrase, it's getting a lot of spin now, integral ecology, and the way he describes this, he says, everything is connected. Our environmental crisis, our economic injustice, our struggles to develop good political societies, our spiritual emptiness, he says, it's all connected. We have to think about how to heal these things all together. So this is beautiful. I mean, there's a lot of great and very inspiring stuff being said, but in our world, we all know that our efforts to make peace are going to be costly and they're going to be really imperfect. The liturgy says we wait in joyful hope. And in the meantime, we're going to practice, right? Like when they made you sit down and practice scales on the piano is what I mean, right? We're going to practice making peace, right? Practice being at peace. So in these few minutes, what I'm really going to focus on, because, peace in the whole world today is kind of big, so we're going to take a slightly smaller slice of it, which is going to be talking about the church as a sacrament of peace in the world now. That's the gift and the duty of the baptized, of the followers of Jesus, disciples of Jesus, to be a sign and, I like to say, a kind of a demonstration plot of peace already in the world. Okay, so give me another one. everybody knows the New Testament says you're supposed to love one another, right? We also know it says love your neighbor, it says love your enemy. So why do you have love one another as well? Doesn't neighbor and enemy pretty much cover it? Well, love one another is a commandment that has to do with how we treat each other within the family of the church. Right? How we're to be with each other. This is what I put up there for you are a small selection of passages in the New Testament about how we are to be with one another. Talking about how Christians should treat each other. And this is, again, not because we're staying in the upper room clustered together, but because we have a call to be a light to the world, to be a sign of what God is doing, of what God intends for us. We are to bear with one another, to admonish one another, to encourage one another, to greet one another with a kiss of peace, right? Because we're that sign. I'll give us another one. And in case you think that's a kind of I guess we can be nice with each other just in the church, I want you to think about how big the Catholic Church is. If we were talking about all Christians, even bigger, right? About 1/6 of the world's population identify as Roman Catholic. About 1/3 of the world's population identify as Christian. So if we talk about the Christians of the world loving one another, bearing with one another, caring for one another in times of sickness, welcoming one another, think about what a powerful witness that could be. I love these statistics because it's so surprising, right? Where are the Catholics in the world these days, right? The most populous, the largest populations of Catholics in the world, Brazil, Mexico, the Philippines. Did you realize that? Did you see number 10 up there? The Democratic Republic of Congo has one of the largest populations of Catholics in the world. When we think about Catholics as a community called to love one another, we're going to have to expand our imaginations, right, of what that looks like. So the bad news, though, mixed in with all this good news, is that we often don't do a good job of fulfilling that call to be a sign of peace for the world. I think I have a slide here, yeah. Consider when we think about, for example, World War II and all of the losses that we lament there. The losses of soldiers, the losses of civilians, genocide, the beginning of the nuclear arms race. How often do we remember to lament that this was Christians killing Christians all over Europe? The Christians of Germany let their habit of patriotism blind them to the fact that they were being called to participate in unjust war. And they attacked the Christians of Poland, of France, and we ended up with Europe as a battlefield covered in the bodies of Christians who had slaughtered each other. I mean, we have to realize when people look at Christianity and say, doesn't look to me like a religion of peace, they have some reason to say that. Okay, let's move on from that. It's depressing. Similarly, we can think about what it means for the church to be a sign of peace given the history and the continuing reality of racial inequality in the United States. What you're looking at there, I lifted this out of the Georgetown archive. Some of you may have been following news lately about Georgetown. This is a handwritten list of slaves who were owned at the St. Joseph Mission in Maryland in 1765. White Christians, including Catholics, held slaves and defended the institution of slavery and practiced it for 250 years on this continent. That Christians in this country have typically worshipped separated by race isn't an accident. It's part of a larger social program that was often championed by white Christians, driven by bigotry, and only very slowly changed. Give us the next slide. I thought this was interesting. This is a newspaper clip from 1953. Right, the bishop in New Orleans urging his people to remember, blessed are the peacemakers, and to end segregation. We still struggle with this. Martin Luther King Jr. said that actually the greatest enemies of the civil rights movement were the moderate white churches who wanted segregation to end, but didn't want any controversy. They didn't want to see any trouble stirred up. They didn't support protesters. They said the protesters were stirring up trouble when they should have been recognizing these were their brothers and sisters speaking controversial truths that had to be faced if we were going to get to peace. The reality is still in our day that to an enormous extent, black and white Christian communities continue to be strangers to each other's faith lives, and in some important respects, strangers to each other's experience of being in the world. Now, I didn't cause that. I didn't do it. You know, I didn't own slaves. I was a baby during the civil rights movement, and I'm not saying that any of you did it. But we inherit a world that's shaped by that reality. That's the world we live in. Some of us have inherited more benefits out of that history. Some have inherited more burdens. All of us have inherited a world shaped by that, and have inherited the biases that come with that. So the question for us is, what are we going to do with that inheritance? And I urge you this year, as you're thinking about the gift of peace, that you pray over, give us another one. This just came out last year, that you read and pray over this document. It's available online. You can just Google it and get this in no time. Short, very accessible document written by the Bishop of Belleville, Indiana, about the reality of racial division within the Catholic Church. You know, you've seen the Dayton Daily News coverage probably recently, remembering 50 years ago the shooting of a black man in West Dayton and the riots that followed after that. Now, at this time, how can the Christian community in the city of Dayton, how can Immaculate Conception in the city of Dayton be a sign, a testament of God's peace? How can we be a sign of the way we love one another because of the mercy of God? So there are a lot of other kinds of things like this that we could talk about. We could talk about the ways that age divides us, right? Or economic class divides us, or gender divides us, and the ways that all of those things overlap and complicate each other. There's a lot to be thought about there. You've got a year. I hope you'll take some time to think about the ways that the church itself has been plagued with division. Divisions that we've become so accustomed to that we don't even notice that there's anything wrong with them in many cases. But having given you these examples of bad things, let me give you an example of something that I think is extraordinarily beautiful as a witness to this gift of peace, the strange heart of Christian peacemaking. In order to do this, we're going to have to do a little history. Okay? So here's my plug. I'm a professor. I got to say this. Our soul work involves brain work, right? And if we're going to look at conflicts and how to build peace, we're going to have to try to investigate where these conflicts come from to understand what's really going on in them. So hang on there. The history's not complicated, but we have to do a little bit of it. So give me a little bit here. We're going to be talking about Algeria. There it is, North Africa. And let me give you a little timeline that helps with the history. So in 1830, France invaded this North African country, Algeria. It was an aggressive war that they waged. It was a trivial pretext. But a lot of countries were doing this kind of thing at that time, invading other countries to establish colonies, right? To gain land that they could use then for their own economic development. So between the middle 1800s into the middle 1900s, Algeria was part of France. And the French used it for their economic development. French and Europeans lived there as a kind of a ruling class. The French promised Algerians that they could have their independence if they helped with the effort in World War II. And then when the French didn't follow up on that promise after World War II, the Algerians launched a war of independence. So 1955, you get this war of independence going on in Algeria. All war is ugly. This was a really brutal, horrible war. Both sides used torture and killed civilians. In 1962, they negotiated a quote-unquote a peace, right? France withdrew. Algeria voted to have its independence, set up a separate government. In France, the word Algeria has something like the feel to it that Vietnam has for us, right? It was a war that the great power lost, and also felt that they'd lost the moral high ground in the fighting of it. So, okay, you got that much? Now, overlay that, what's going on here also is that most native Algerians speak Arabic and are Muslim, and most of the French colonists spoke French and are Catholic. Okay, so moving on from there. So during this War of Independence, in the 1950s, early 60s, there was a French seminarian actually went as a soldier in Algeria. He was doing his mandatory military service for a couple of years. And Christian de Chergé is this guy's name. He was involved in a kind of what we think of as like a winning a hearts and minds sort of campaign, right? And as part of that, he developed ties with this local Muslim policeman whose name is Muhammad. Okay, no kidding, this is a true story. Christian and Muhammad, these are the two guys' names, right? And Christian, as I said, was a seminarian. He was just doing his mandatory military service. And he and Muhammad would go for these long walks and talk about their faith. They were both very devout people. And Christian was really kind of convicted by Muhammad's objection. He said, I don't see the Christian soldiers praying. What's with you people? Muslims know we have to pray 5 times a day. What are the Christians doing, right? And so they would have these very interesting arguments and exchanges about their ideas. One day they're out having one of these talks, and a group of Algerian insurgents comes upon them and threatens Christian's life. Muhammad stepped in front of him and told them to back off, that he was a good man and they should leave him alone. So Muhammad intervened to protect Christian. The next day, Muhammad was found murdered because he had protected Christian. So Muhammad laid down his life for his friend. Although that might be a bit of an exaggeration because there's another sense in which Christian was kind of his enemy, right? As a French soldier, part of the occupying force there. So Christian de Chergé felt that in Algeria, in this relationship with a Muslim, he had encountered the gift of peace, right? He had encountered the peace of Christ, this sort of God's mercy establishing right relationships even in the middle of the world's mess, God's faithfulness to us. Christian finished his military service, he went back to France, and he discerned a call to be a monk, and specifically to be a monk in Algeria. He felt that his calling was tied up with the Muslims of Algeria. So he spent the rest of his life in a monastery there, contemplating this mystery that he had encountered, right, in his friend Muhammad. Now, this is really key, okay? This is really key. You gotta get this part. Christian didn't go to Algeria because he was a nice peacemaker and Algeria was at war. He went to Algeria because he was struggling to love God and he had encountered the peace of Christ there. Right? He went there because his struggle for his soul was tied up with the struggle of Algerians as well. He belonged with them. So, go on there, the next one. This is the community. Christian joined this monastery, Our Lady of Mount Atlas. There's a little group of monks there doing monk stuff. You know, they pray a lot, they farm. Now, the Quran very specifically, monk stuff, right? The Quran specifically calls for honor and respect toward Christian monks, right? Because of their reverence and their devotion to prayer. And so during the War of Independence, as much violence as there was in Algeria, the area right around that monastery was unusually peaceful. It was relatively free from violence because the Quran calls for respect for monasteries, for monks. So a village grew up around the monastery because people found it was a relatively safe place to live. The presence of these monks created a sign and also a little reality, a little demonstration plot, right, for peace in the midst of all this violence. And they did this in the way that Christians have carried the witness of peace through the ages, by following the Beatitudes, right? Poverty in spirit, their meekness, their simplicity, their purity, their commitment to prayer. This is what made them an effective sign of peace in that place. So the monks had hired some local Muslims to help them with their farm work. They had a little medical clinic, which they would let villagers also access. But the monks were French, And most of them harbored a good bit of mistrust of Algerians, this history between France and Algeria, right? And as Christian monks, they just felt like Islam was alien, right, to their calling. It was strange and foreign to them. So Christian de Chergé joins this monastery in 1971, and one of those things you have to do to one another, commands in the New Testament, my very favorite one, I think, is bear with one another. Christian joins them in 1971, and for the next 20 years, that community bore with Christian because he came there saying, God's doing something among Muslims. We've got to think about this. I've encountered the peace of Christ in Algeria, and this was not what the other brothers, it's not the way they thought about their calling there. So 20 years, right, this is going on within this community, arguments and discussions and push and pull. And eventually, over time, Christian won them over enough that the monastery became a center for interfaith dialogue. He initiated a series of interfaith dialogue meetings between Christians and Muslims based there in the monastery. So the conflict broke out again in the early 90s. And to make a very complicated situation extremely simple, some people were saying Algeria should become more like France. That's a successful model. And other people were saying, hey, we don't want to be like those people. They oppressed us. They occupied our country. They attacked us unjustly. We should reject their model and do something else. And between those two groups, there developed a violent civil conflict in the 90s. Now then, as now, Muslim teachers around the world are very clear about this, that attacks against civilians are strictly forbidden in Islam. But as sometimes happens among Christians, as we've seen, Muslims don't necessarily fight by the rules that they're supposed to fight by. And there was a group in this conflict who decided that attacking any civilian who looked like they were friendly to Western style, right? Anybody who was collaborating with the colonial style was a legitimate target, and they were attacking civilians. Then they put out an announcement, any foreigner living in Algeria is a legitimate target. You got 30 days to get out of the country. So the monks had to think about this because they were French Christian. And their initial impulse was obviously that they should relocate, and they did send their novices away. But they were asked by two groups to stay. One of them was the small Catholic community in their area. The bishop came to them and said, "You are the lungs of our church. We need you here." The second group was the villagers in their area who said, "We moved here because we have some peace. We're relatively safe here, but that only lasts as long as the monastery is here. If you leave, we're subject to much worse violence." So because they had discovered that they belonged with their neighbors there, they chose to stay. In 1996, eventually, 7 of the monks from the monastery were kidnapped and killed, including Christian de Chergé. They were kidnapped by the guerrillas. We're not actually sure what happened, who killed them. There's some evidence that it was the guerrillas who killed them. There's some evidence, actually, that they were killed in a botched rescue attempt by the security forces. It's really not clear what happened. What we know is that they were kidnapped, and as a result of that, they were killed. In cases like this, we have a very strong instinct, a moral instinct, to lash out at the people who killed them, right? We're so helpless to do anything to show how we grieve those deaths. And so the instinct is to reject and to punish the people who did this to them. And because he knew that instinct was so strong for us, Christian de Chergé, when they made this decision to stay in Algeria, wrote what he called his testament. It was kind of a last letter for his family and friends if it happened that he was violently killed in Algeria. So we're gonna look at that, but I forgot something I was gonna tell you, so I gotta back up for a second. Go on to the next slide here. That instinct we have to lash out, you know, this is an image, you can't see that very well, but it's an image of Christ from the catacombs in Rome. You know, the early church knew a lot about this. They lived in a violent context, and good people got killed unjustly. They didn't lash out. They did what, in fact, the scriptures told them to do, to continue to pray for the emperor, to continue to offer their witness of peace, to do good where evil had been done to them. This image of Christ from the catacombs, it's interesting to me. If they could have put an image of Christ there by the grave of a martyr that showed Christ coming in judgment to smite all the evildoers. And I could understand why you would want to do that. But instead, the image they put by those was the Good Shepherd. An image of pastoral care for the divided flock in the world. Okay, so Christian left this message that I was talking about, this testament, to be opened in case he suffered a violent death. You have the text of it actually in your folders. My copy was kind of orange. And I'm going to give you a chance to look through the whole of it in a minute here. I want to show you just a couple of little bits of it because he was a monk, right? So it's a little dense sometimes, sort of deep thinker. I want to look at just a couple of sections of it with you first, and then I'll cut you loose to spend more time with it on your own. So it begins, if it should happen one day. There's a section here, if you want to look at the part that's up here rather than the sheet, that's probably better for the moment. He writes that he wants his loved ones to associate his death with so many other equally violent ones which are forgotten through indifference or anonymity. He says, my life has no more value than any other, nor any less value. In any case, it has not the innocence of childhood. I've lived long enough to know that I am an accomplice in the evil which seems to prevail so terribly in the world, even in the evil which might blindly strike me down. Now that's this is a Trappist monk who says, I identify myself as an accomplice in the violence that's going on here. You know, I told you earlier that we have to be careful to remember the gift of peace isn't a gift of escape or a gift of fantasy, getting away from the world. The gift of peace is about our being drawn into the belonging that God is trying to restore for all humanity. We're being drawn into God's love for the whole world. And that means we're being drawn into God's mercy for everyone. You know, if our Christian commitment to peace, if our gift of peace in some respect makes us feel superior or free of the burden of sin or somehow more loved by God than anybody else, then something's gone wrong with the way we're understanding this gift of peace. It is an offering of mercy to us from God. We have been invited into peace by God's mercy. And an offering for us to participate in God's giving of mercy to the whole world. I'm so glad you spent last year thinking about mercy, because you're going to need that to think about peace. We are a broken people who live in a broken world. And peace means we're discovering that even so, even in the midst of that, we belong to God and to each other. Give us the next bit. Another little bit I wanted to look at. He says, obviously my death will appear to confirm those who hastily judge me naive or idealistic. Let him tell us now what he thinks of his ideals. But these persons should know that finally my most avid curiosity will be set free. This is what I shall be able to do, God willing. Immerse my gaze in that of the Father, right? To look with God, to contemplate with him as children of Islam, just as he sees them, all shining with the glory of Christ, the fruit of his passion, filled with the gift of the Spirit, whose secret joy will always be to establish communion and restore likeness, playing with difference. Okay, that's deep. Let's start here. Christian de Chergé was a devout Catholic, right? I mean, he's a Trappist monk. So he's not saying any of this because he doesn't think Catholicism is important. He's saying this because he didn't feel the need to be defensive in the face of Islam. His encounters with Islam told him, God is doing something here. I don't know how this works. I don't know exactly what it is. I don't understand how it happens. But instead of being frightened or defensive by that, it makes him curious. He says he's curious. He can't wait to get to see what Muslims look like to God, because he thinks there's something there that he doesn't understand. God is at work in the world in ways that surprise us. Can we be able to meet that without fear or defensiveness? We belong to God. We have no reason to fear this, no reason to be jealous. What is it that we can see going on among other people who we wouldn't have expected to be able to reveal something about Christ to us? So these words of Christian de Churget are words of a man who knows that he belongs to God and that all creation belongs to God, and that all of us belong together because of God's mercy. I think that's the gift of peace and the challenge that it poses to us. So I'm going to give you a little time. You have the text, the whole text of his testament there. Will you go on to the next bit? To invite you, either or, as you like, to reflect more on the text of this, thinking about where you've seen the church as a demonstration plot of peace, right? Where you've seen these signs of peace breaking out in the world. And what broken relations, what estrangements you think God is calling you to address. Right? And or take some time to pray about this, because I'm so with Spencer and Father Satish in this. Our work of peace has to be rooted in our prayer. To give thanks to God for the witness of so many Christians who are peacemakers, to give thanks for the riches of God's mercy poured out on us and on the world, and to pray for an unfolding gift of peace in the midst of a world of so much brokenness, and so much brokenness in our hearts, in our communities, and nationally and internationally. So I'll leave you for some time to do that, and Father Satish will tell us what to do after that. Okay. Thank you.